Welcome back, everyone, and if you're new here, I'm so glad you found the channel. We're on an exciting journey to reach 10k subscribers by next year, and every like, comment and subscription brings us one step closer. Your support means everything. Now, let's jump into today's video. The brass sign above the shop door shouldn't have been there. I'd walked down this particular London street hundreds of times over the years, tracing the same path between my flat and the British Library, where I worked as a rare books conservator. But on this bitter December evening, as rain pelted the cobblestones and fog crept through the narrow alleyways, something changed. The weathered sign reading Tempest Antiquities creaked on its hinges, though there was no wind. I stood there, water dripping from my coat, staring at the storefront that had materialized between the familiar wool merchant shop and the old bookbinders. The windows were clouded with age, but I could make out the shadowy shapes of antiques within, and something about them called to me with an almost physical pull. My obsession with the Victorian era had begun in my grandfather's antique shop, where I spent countless childhood hours poring over photographs and leather-bound volumes. That fascination had shaped my entire life, leading me to specialize in 19th century literature preservation. But nothing in my years of study had prepared me for what waited behind that door. The bell above the entrance chimed with a discordant note as I stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, brass polish, and something else. Something that reminded me of thunderstorms and burnt sugar. Shelves stretched into impossible shadows, laden with curiosities that seemed to shift and change when viewed from the corner of my eye. "Mr. Blackwood," a voice called from the darkness. "I've been expecting you." I hadn't given my name, Michael Blackwood, to anyone. The speaker emerged from between two towering bookcases. An elderly man in an impeccably tailored Victorian suit, his face deeply lined, but his eyes sharp and clear as cut glass. He moved with a peculiar grace that seemed to leave after images in the air, like a multiple exposure photograph. "How do you know my name?" I asked, but he was already moving toward a glass display case, his shoes making no sound on the creaking floorboards. "You seek passage," he said, his words carrying an accent I couldn't place, something that seemed to blend eras rather than regions. "Passage to a time you've only read about in your precious books." He unlocked the case with a key that appeared in his hand as if conjured. "But I must warn you, Mr. Blackwood, the past you yearn for exists only in ink and paper. The reality—" He withdrew an object wrapped in midnight blue velvet. "The reality is far darker than your histories suggest." The chronograph he revealed was beautiful in its complexity. A brass device slightly larger than a pocket watch, its face marked with concentric circles of symbols I almost recognized. The glass covering the dial was unlike anything I'd seen before, seeming to swallow light rather than reflect it. "The winter solstice approaches," the old man continued, holding out the chronograph. "Should you wish to use this, that will be your only opportunity. But remember, the London you find may not be the one you seek." His fingers brushed mine as he passed me the device, and I flinched at their unnatural coldness. "Time has teeth, Mr. Blackwood, and it hungers." I should have heeded his warning, should have seen the predatory gleam in his eyes, recognized the way shadows clung to him like hungry things. But my obsession had already taken root, growing like ivy through the cracks in my judgment. I purchased the chronograph for a sum that should have seemed suspiciously reasonable, and left the shop in a daze. When I looked back from the street corner, Tempest Antiquities was gone, as if it had never existed. Only the weight of the chronograph in my pocket assured me I hadn't imagined the entire encounter. The winter solstice was 3 days away. As I walked home through the deepening London night, I felt the device tick against my chest, its rhythm slightly out of sync with my heartbeat. Above me, gas lamps flickered in sequence, and in their stuttering light, I could have sworn my shadow moved independently of my steps. The past was waiting, and it was hungry. The next 3 days passed in a fever of preparation. I spent hours studying the chronograph, noting how its numerous dials and indicators seemed to reorganize themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. The main face showed traditional clock hands, but behind them, secondary hands moved in contrary directions, tracking something beyond mere minutes and hours. My flat, already cluttered with Victorian artifacts and research materials, became a nest of obsession. I surrounded myself with period maps of London, photographs, and contemporary accounts of daily life. The chronograph never left my person. I even slept with it nearby, its soft ticking a lullaby of brass and gears. On the evening of the solstice, I dressed with careful attention to historical accuracy, a black frock coat, waistcoat, and cravat that had cost me months of savings from various historical reenactment suppliers. The clothing was crucial. I needed to blend in seamlessly with the London of 1858, my chosen destination year. Perhaps if I had spent less time researching fashion and more time questioning why the chronograph's hands occasionally moved in directions that shouldn't have been possible, things might have ended differently. As midnight approached, the air in my flat grew heavy with anticipation. The chronograph's ticking grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to echo from every corner of the room. The glass face began to emit a subtle glow, a deep blue radiance that reminded me of gas flames and fever dreams. Outside my window, London's modern skyline began to blur and shift. The familiar orange glow of sodium lights dimmed, replaced by the warmer, more erratic illumination of gas lamps. The constant background hum of the city changed pitch, dropping lower and lower until it became the distant clatter of hooves and iron-rimmed wheels. My hands shook as I wound the chronograph's mainspring. The device grew warm, then cold, then impossibly warm again. The ticking accelerated until it matched my racing heartbeat, then surpassed it. Reality began to fold around me like origami made of moments, each crease revealing glimpses of other times, other Londons. The sensation that followed defied description. Imagine being turned inside out, not physically, but temporally. Every moment of your life simultaneously compressed and expanded. I felt my consciousness stretch like taffy, thin and vulnerable, as time itself seized me in iron jaws and pulled. When the world stopped spinning, I found myself on my hands and knees on wet cobblestones. The first thing I noticed was the smell, not the romanticized atmosphere of historical fiction, but a thick miasma of coal smoke, rotting vegetables, and human misery. The fog that pressed against my face was yellow-tinged and seemed almost solid, carrying particles that glittered like diamond dust in the sickly light of the gas lamps. I stood unsteadily, adjusting my clothing and checking that the chronograph was secure in my waistcoat pocket. It was still ticking, but the sound had changed, deeper somehow, with irregular pauses between beats that reminded me of a dying man's heart. This was London, certainly. I recognised the general layout of the streets, the architectural styles, but something was terribly wrong. The buildings loomed at impossible angles, their windows like hungry eyes watching my every move. The fog parted and closed around me with deliberate purpose, and in its swirling patterns, I caught glimpses of faces that vanished when I tried to focus on them. A carriage clattered past, its black, lacquered sides reflecting the gaslight in ways that hurt my eyes. The horses were too tall, too thin, their movements jerky, like poorly operated marionettes. The driver's face was hidden in the shadows of his hat, but I could have sworn I saw too many teeth gleaming in the darkness, where his mouth should be. "You shouldn't be here," a woman's voice said behind me. I turned to find a figure in a midnight blue dress that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. Her face was beautiful in the way that Victorian memento mori photographs were beautiful, posed, perfect, and utterly devoid of life. The city knows you don't belong. It can smell the future on your skin. "I'm sorry," I stammered, trying to maintain my composure. "I'm a bit lost. Could you tell me exactly where I am?" Her laugh was like breaking glass. "You're nowhere, Mr. Blackwood, or perhaps everywhere. The London you sought doesn't exist. It never did. This is where time comes to die." Before I could question her further, she stepped backward into the fog and vanished. But her words hung in the air like poison gas, and as I looked more carefully at my surroundings, I began to understand what she meant. The street signs changed their text when I tried to read them. Gas lamps cast shadows in multiple directions simultaneously, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of thousands of clocks striking different hours all at once, their discordant chimes creating a symphony of temporal chaos. I had found my way to the Victorian era, yes, but this was not the London of history books. This was something else entirely, something that wore London's face like an ill-fitting mask. And as I stood there, in the writhing fog, the chronograph in my pocket began to tick backward. The real horror was just beginning. I forced myself to move forward through the fog, which seemed to resist each step like thick syrup. The streets of this twisted London curved in ways that defied both memory and logic. I passed shop windows filled with strange merchandise, dolls that turned their heads to watch me pass, clockworks that ran on dark liquids instead of gears, and mirrors that reflected scenes from different centuries. A group of children darted past me, their laughter echoing strangely in the fog. Their clothes were period appropriate, but their movements were too fluid, too synchronized. As they disappeared around a corner, I noticed they left no footprints in the muddy street, despite the recent rain. The chronograph's backwards ticking grew more pronounced, and with each step, I felt reality shift around me. Gas lamps flickered in sequence, creating patterns that seemed to form words in a language I almost understood. The cobblestones beneath my feet occasionally rippled like the surface of a disturbed pond. "First time crossing?" The voice came from a doorway I could have sworn was empty moments before. A woman stepped into the sickly lamplight, her elegant Victorian dress shifting between deep purple and absolute darkness. She introduced herself as Isabella Rothschild, and unlike the phantom children or the grotesque carriage driver, she seemed solid, real. "You're like me," she said, her eyes fixing on the chronograph's chain visible at my waist. "Another fool who thought the past would be kinder than the present." She moved closer, her steps unnaturally silent. "How long have you been here?" "I just arrived," I replied, fighting the urge to step backward. This can't be the real Victorian era." Isabella's laugh was bitter. "Oh, but it is. This is the truth behind the history books. Your precious Victorian age was built on foundations of chronological corruption. The history you studied was merely the pretty lie they placed atop this rotting reality." Before I could question her further, the fog parted to reveal a procession moving down the street. Men in top hats and women in fine dresses, all walking in perfect unison, their faces blank and expressionless. Behind them came a carriage unlike any I'd seen in my research. Its black surface seemed to swallow light, and instead of horses, it was pulled by things that moved like horses but were composed entirely of living shadow. "The Parliament of Shadows," Isabella whispered, pulling me back into the doorway. "They're the ones who made this place what it is. They found a way to trap time itself, to feed on it. All those romantic notions you had about the Victorian era, they're just the chains they used to lure people like us." The procession passed, and I noticed something disturbing. None of the figures cast shadows, despite the gas lamps. Instead, their shadows seemed to walk beside them, slightly out of sync with their movements. "Listen carefully," Isabella continued, her fingers digging into my arm. This London exists in a loop, but not the kind you're thinking of. It's not a simple repetition of events. It's more like, imagine time as a tapestry. Now imagine something eating holes in that tapestry and replacing the missing sections with nightmare silk. That's what they did to this era. She reached into a hidden pocket and withdrew what looked like a small compass, but its needle spun wildly, occasionally pointing in directions that shouldn't exist. If you want to survive here, you need to understand the rules. First, never look at the moon. It's not really the moon anymore. Second, if you hear someone whistling, "Pop goes the weasel," run. Third, and most importantly, don't trust anyone who casts a perfect shadow. The sound of bells began to echo through the streets. Not the familiar tolling of church bells, but a deeper, more resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Isabella's face paled. "They're starting the night harvest," she said. "We need to move. The collectors will be out soon." She grabbed my hand, her touch fever hot. "Come with me if you want to learn the truth about what happened to the real Victorian London." I hesitated only a moment before following her into the shadows. The chronograph in my pocket had stopped ticking entirely now, and in its silence, I could hear something else. The sound of time itself being torn apart, 1 second at a time. As we hurried through the twisted streets, I began to notice other wrong details I had missed in my initial shock. The people we passed were dressed appropriately for the era, but their clothes showed subtle wrongness. Buttons that seemed to shift position when not directly observed. Patterns that moved of their own accord. Gloves that appeared to be filled with something other than hands. Isabella led me through a maze of alleyways that seemed to rearrange themselves behind us. The fog grew thicker, but rather than obscuring our path, it appeared to guide us, forming corridors of clearer air that we followed at a near run. The sound of the bells grew more distant, but was replaced by something worse. A soft, wet sound, like something massive breathing just out of sight. Finally, Isabella stopped at a heavy wooden door set into the side of what appeared to be an abandoned factory. The brick walls stretched upward into the fog, their true height impossible to determine. She produced an ornate key from her sleeve and inserted it into the lock. The mechanism made a sound like breaking bones as it turned. "Welcome," she said, ushering me inside, "to the Resistance." The interior defied all logic. What should have been a simple factory floor was instead a vast chamber filled with flickering gaslight and twisted machinery. Brass pipes wound their way up the walls like metallic vines, occasionally releasing bursts of steam that formed impossible shapes before dissipating. The ceiling, barely visible in the gloom, appeared to be moving, though I quickly looked away when I realized the movement was caused by thousands of crawling shadows. People moved about the space with purpose, some dressed in Victorian attire like Isabella and myself, others in clothing from various eras. I saw a woman in 1920s flapper dress comparing notes with a man wearing what looked like 18th century court dress, while nearby, someone in modern business attire carefully adjusted a device that resembled a cross between a telescope and a music box. "Time travellers," Isabella explained, noting my confusion. "All of us trapped here by the Parliament of Shadows. Some have been here for what feels like centuries, others for mere days. Time doesn't flow properly here, so it's hard to tell." She led me to a large table covered in maps of London, but not any London I recognised. The streets formed patterns that hurt my eyes to look at, and locations I knew well were marked with unfamiliar names and ominous warnings. "The Parliament didn't just corrupt this era," a new voice said. I turned to find a tall, distinguished-looking man approaching us. His clothing was impeccable Victorian dress, but his eyes held the weight of centuries. They're using it as a foundation to corrupt all of history. "Dr. Helena Graves," Isabella introduced him. "He was one of the first to discover what was really happening here. "Please," he said, "call me James. We gave up on formal titles after the third temporal collapse." He pointed to various locations on the map. "What you're seeing isn't just a twisted version of Victorian London. It's a cancer in time itself. The Parliament found a way to harvest temporal energy from human souls. They created this pocket of corrupted history as a feeding ground." A distant scream echoed through the building, causing everyone to pause momentarily in their activities. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and contained notes that no human throat should be able to produce. "The night harvest has begun," James said grimly. "They'll be feeding now." He turned to Isabella. "Show him the viewing room. He needs to understand what we're really fighting against." Isabella nodded and led me through a maze of corridors. The walls seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light, and I could have sworn I saw hands reaching out from the shadows when I wasn't looking directly at them. We emerged into a circular room dominated by a large window that overlooked the city, but this wasn't the London I had arrived in. The view showed me what was really happening during the harvest. The fog had transformed into writhing tentacles of pure darkness that wrapped around buildings and reached into windows. Shadow beings stalked the streets, their forms constantly shifting between human shapes and something far more horrific. Above it all, where the moon should have been, was a massive eye that slowly scanned the city below. "The Parliament feeds on time itself," Isabella explained, her voice barely a whisper. "They drain it from people's lives, extending their own existence while trapping their victims in endless loops of suffering. Every night they harvest more temporal energy, using it to expand their influence beyond this era." As we watched, a tendril of darkness wrapped around a distant figure walking the streets. The person's form seemed to age decades in seconds, their body twisting and contorting as their temporal energy was drained. When the tendril withdrew, what was left behind was barely recognizable as human, a desiccated husk that somehow still moved, now just another puppet for the Parliament to control. "That's why there are so many ghosts in Victorian literature," James added, having followed us to the viewing room. "They weren't ghosts at all, but temporal echoes, the remains of people who'd had their time stolen from them. The great authors of the era could sense something was wrong, but they couldn't comprehend the full horror of it. They turned it into stories about spirits and phantoms because the truth was too terrible to face." I clutched the chronograph in my pocket, which had begun to tick again, but now each tick sounded like a stifled scream. "How do we stop them?" James and Isabella exchanged glances. "We've been trying for longer than you can imagine," Isabella said, "but we might finally have a chance. Your chronograph, it's different from the others we've seen. The craftsmanship, the materials, it might be exactly what we've been waiting for." James moved to a large cabinet against the wall and withdrew a leather-bound volume. The book's cover appeared to be made from something that wasn't quite leather, and the pages seemed to move slightly even when closed. According to our research, the Parliament's power comes from a device they call the Great Mechanism. It's hidden beneath Buckingham Palace, or rather, what appears to be Buckingham Palace in this twisted version of London. He opened the book, revealing diagrams that seemed to shift and change as I tried to focus on them. The mechanism is what allows them to harvest and store temporal energy, but it requires a key to maintain its stability. We believe your chronograph might be that key, or rather, a replica of it. "The shop where I bought it," I said slowly, realization dawning. "The old man who sold it to me was almost certainly one of them," Isabella finished. "But they made a mistake. They're so confident in their power, they sometimes enjoy playing games with time travelers. They give out chronographs as bait, drawing in new victims to feed upon. But this time," she reached out and touched my chronograph through my waistcoat pocket. "This time they gave away something far more powerful than they intended." A loud crash from somewhere in the building interrupted our conversation. Screams and the sound of running feet echoed through the corridors. James rushed to the door, his face pale. "They found us," he said. "The Parliament knows we have the chronograph. We need to move, now." We fled the viewing room, running through corridors that seemed to lengthen and twist as we passed through them. The walls pulsed with an unhealthy light, and shadows reached for us with clawed hands. Behind us, I could hear something pursuing, something that moved with a sound like tearing silk and smelled of grave dirt and oxidized metal. Isabella led us down a narrow staircase that spiraled far deeper than should have been possible. The air grew colder with each step, and the gaslight gave way to a phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The stone steps beneath our feet were worn in impossible patterns, as though they had experienced millions of years of use in the space of days. We emerged into a vast underground chamber that appeared to be part of London's ancient sewers, but these tunnels had never appeared in any historical record. The bricks were carved with symbols that changed when looked at directly, and the water that flowed through the channels was black and thick, occasionally showing faces that disappeared when you tried to focus on them. "The Underground Railroad," James explained as we hurried along a narrow walkway. "Not the American one. This is something far older. These tunnels exist in every version of London throughout history. The Parliament uses them to move between eras, but we've learned to use them too." A distant roar echoed through the tunnels, causing the black water to ripple. Isabella quickened her pace. "That'll be the chronophage," she said. "They only release those when they're desperate. We must really have them worried." "What's a chronophage?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. "Time eaters," James replied, grimly. "Imagine a creature that can consume not just your life, but every moment you've ever existed. They don't just kill you, they erase you from history itself." The roar came again, closer this time. In the darkness behind us, I could see something moving, something massive that seemed to be composed of living darkness and ticking clockwork. The sound of thousands of watches ticking at different speeds filled the tunnel, creating a maddening cacophony. "Here!" Isabella stopped at what appeared to be a dead end. She pressed her hand against the wall, and the bricks rearranged themselves, revealing a hidden chamber. We rushed inside just as the ticking grew deafening. The chamber was small, sir, and circular, its walls covered in brass pipes and pulsing valves that seemed more organic than mechanical. In the centre stood a pedestal, holding a device that looked unsettlingly similar to my chronograph, but larger and somehow wrong, as though it had been constructed in some other reality where the laws of physics work differently. "The temporal forge," James said, "one of the only places in this London where we can work with time itself. If we're right about your chronograph, we might be able to use it to create a weapon, something that could destroy the great mechanism and end the Parliament's reign once and for all." The pounding at the outer wall grew more intense. The bricks began to bulge inward as though something impossibly strong was trying to break through. The air grew thick with the scent of burning metal and decay. "We don't have much time," Isabella said, moving to the forge. "Michael, your chronograph, we need it now." With trembling fingers, I withdrew the device from my pocket. In the strange light of the forge, I could see new details in its construction, patterns that seemed to move across its surface, numbered dials that showed impossible times, hands that pointed in directions that shouldn't exist. Isabella took it reverently and placed it on the pedestal beside the larger device. The moment the two objects were close to each other, the air in the chamber changed. Colours became sharper, sounds gained new dimensions, and I could feel time itself bending around us like light through a prism. "The temporal resonance is stronger than we hoped," James said, examining the readings on various brass instruments mounted on the walls. "This might actually work." Isabella began adjusting valves and levers on the forge. Steam hissed from joints in the machinery, forming shapes in the air that my mind refused to process. The chronograph began to vibrate, its ticking growing louder and more distorted, until it sounded like the screams of dying stars. The wall behind us finally burst inward, Through the breach, I caught glimpses of the chronophage, a writhing mass of darkness studded with countless clock faces, each showing a different time, each ticking with the sound of breaking bones. Tentacles of pure shadow reached into the chamber, bringing with them the smell of forgotten centuries. "Keep working," James shouted, pulling what looked like a modified flare gun from his coat. "I'll hold it back." He fired, and the flash that erupted from the weapon was pure white, carrying with it the essence of stolen daylight. The chronophage recoiled, its many clock faces spinning wildly. Isabella's hands flew over the forge's controls. The chronograph began to glow with an inner light that hurt to look at directly. I could feel something building in the air, a pressure not just on my body, but on my very existence. "Michael," Isabella called over the chaos, "we need your help. The chronograph responds to its owner. You have to be the one to complete the fusion." She guided my hands to two brass handles protruding from the forge. The metal was warm, almost alive under my touch. The moment I gripped them, reality shifted. I could see time, not as a linear progression, but as an ocean of possibilities, each moment connecting to countless others in patterns that defied comprehension. "Focus on the chronograph," Isabella instructed. "Feel its connection to time itself. The Parliament uses that connection to steal temporal energy. We're going to use it to fight back." The chronophage was recovering from James's attack. Its vast bulk began to squeeze through the breach, bringing with it the sound of every clock in London striking midnight simultaneously. James fired again and again, but each flash of stolen daylight seemed weaker than the last. I closed my eyes and concentrated on the chronograph, feeling its rhythms align with my heartbeat. Through it, I could sense the great mechanism at the heart of this twisted London, a massive construct of brass and darkness that pulsed with stolen time. I could feel the Parliament of Shadows gathered around it, their forms barely contained by their human disguises, as they fed on the temporal energy of countless victims. The pressure in the chamber reached a crescendo. The chronograph's ticking merged with the sound of the forge until they became a single note that resonated with the fundamental frequency of time itself. Light blazed from both devices, so bright that I could see it through my closed eyelids. "Now!" Isabella shouted. "Push all of that energy into the chronograph. Make it into something they can't control." I did as she instructed, channeling the temporal energy through my body and into the device. Pain lanced through every nerve, as moments that weren't mine to experience flooded my consciousness. I saw London as it had been, as it should have been, as it never was, all existing simultaneously in the space between seconds. The chronograph absorbed it all, its brass case beginning to transform into something that metal should never be able to become. The hands on its face spun so fast they left trails of fire in the air, and the symbols around its edge rearranged themselves into patterns that spoke of endings and beginnings. Just as I thought the power would tear me apart, everything stopped. The light faded, the pressure released, and the chamber fell silent save for a new sound, the ticking of the transformed chronograph, each beat like a hammer striking the anvil of reality. Isabella stared at the device in wonder. It had changed completely, its brass surface now covered in shifting patterns that seemed to reflect every moment in London's history simultaneously. The hands had multiplied, each moving to a different rhythm, measuring not just time but the very fabric of existence. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it. We have our weapon." The chronophage had withdrawn, driven back by the power we had unleashed. But in the distance, carried on a wind that smelled of dust and decay, I could hear the bells of Parliament beginning to toll. They knew what we had created. They were coming, and this time they would bring everything they had. "We need to move," James said, reloading his light weapon. "They'll bring the full might of Parliament down on this location. We have to reach Buckingham Palace before they can fortify it." Isabella carefully lifted the transformed chronograph from the forge. In her hands, it pulsed with inner light, each tick sending ripples through the fabric of reality around us. "The tunnels will be crawling with their servants," she said. "We'll have to go above ground." We emerged from the hidden chamber into streets that had transformed in our absence. The fog had become almost solid, forming architectures of vapour that reached toward a sky that no longer existed. In its place was a vast, swirling vortex of darkness, punctuated by the faces of countless clocks, each showing a different apocalypse. The buildings around us had shed their pretense of normality, their facades twisted and writhed, windows becoming eyes, doors gaping like hungry mouths. The cobblestones beneath our feet pulsed with a sickly light, and in the spaces between them, something dark and fluid flowed like blood through veins. We moved through this nightmare landscape as quickly as we dared. The transformed chronograph seemed to protect us, its presence pushing back the worst of the horrors that reached for us from the shadows. But it couldn't hide us from everything. A carrion cry split the air, a sound that existed somewhere between the toll of a funeral bell and the scream of a dying star. Looking up, we saw them, the Parliament of Shadows in their true form, abandoning their human disguises as they descended from their perch in the twisted sky. They were vast, their bodies composed of living darkness and twisted time. Clock faces studded their forms like scales, each showing the death of a different moment. Their movements left trails in reality itself, and where they passed, the very substance of London seemed to decay and transform. "Run!" Isabella shouted, clutching the chronograph closer. We fled through streets that rearranged themselves with each step, pursued by horrors that had never existed in any history book. The air itself seemed to fight against us, thick with the accumulated weight of stolen centuries. A shadow fell across our path, one of the Parliament members, its form barely contained by the dimensions we could perceive. It reached for us with hands that were composed of compressed time, each finger ending in a different era's death. James fired his weapon, the blast of stolen daylight tearing through the creature's substance. It recoiled with a sound like tearing reality, but more were coming. The very buildings around us began to melt and flow as the Parliament exerted their full power over this domain they had created. "There," Isabella pointed ahead. Through the chaos, I could see Buckingham Palace, or what this twisted London pretended was Buckingham Palace. The building rose like a mountain of nightmares, its architecture an impossible fusion of every royal residence that had ever existed or would exist. Dark energy pulsed from its windows, and the space around it seemed to bend and distort. We were almost to the gates when the ground beneath us erupted. The cobblestones split apart, revealing a massive mechanism of brass and shadow, a scaled-down version of the great mechanism itself, brought to the surface to stop us, its gears ground together with the sound of breaking bones and steam vented from its joints in patterns that formed screaming faces. "The chronograph." Isabella thrust the device into my hands. "It has to be you. You're connected to it. You have to use it." The transformed chronograph pulsed in my grip, its ticking synchronizing with my heartbeat. Through it, I could feel the vast machinery of corrupted time that the Parliament had built, the countless souls trapped in their eternal harvest. The weight of all that stolen time pressed against my consciousness, threatening to overwhelm me. But there was something else there too, a weakness in their system. The Parliament's power was built on stolen moments, forced into unnatural configurations. The chronograph we had created was different. It contained time in its natural state, pure and uncorrupted. Understanding flooded through me. The chronograph wasn't just a weapon. It was a key to unlocking the truth that the Parliament had tried to bury. The real Victorian era wasn't dead. It was just trapped, compressed beneath layers of their corruption. As the Parliament closed in around us, their vast forms blotting out what remained of the sky, I held up the chronograph and began to turn back time itself, not to escape, but to set it free. The device grew warm in my hands, its ticking becoming a deep resonance that shook the foundations of reality. The corrupted time that the Parliament had accumulated over centuries began to unravel. The twisted architecture of their false London started to crack, revealing glimpses of the true city beneath, the real Victorian era they had hidden away. "No!" The voice came from everywhere at once, spoken by every member of the Parliament, simultaneously. Their shadow forms writhed in obvious pain as the chronograph's power grew stronger. "You don't understand what you're doing. We preserved this era, we kept it safe from the ravages of progress." "You imprisoned it," I shouted back, my voice carrying the weight of every moment they had stolen. "You turned it into a feeding ground for your own immortality." The great mechanism beneath the palace began to rise, tearing through the ground with grinding gears and shrieking metal. It was vast beyond comprehension, a cathedral of brass and shadow that defied all natural laws. But I could see the flaw in its design now, the fundamental wrongness that the chronograph could exploit. Isabella and James stood beside me, their forms flickering between different moments of their own timelines as reality began to collapse around us. "Whatever you're going to do," Isabella said, her voice echoing strangely, "do it now. The whole temporal structure is coming apart." I reached out through the chronograph, feeling the true rhythm of time beneath the Parliament's corruption. The device in my hands was no longer just a machine. It had become a conduit for something far more fundamental. Every tick released another moment from their control. Every turn of its hands unwound another layer of their false history. The Parliament members began to dissolve, their carefully maintained forms unable to hold together as their power base crumbled. They reached for us with appendages made of compressed centuries, but each touch only accelerated their own destruction. Their screams echoed across time itself, a sound that would haunt the nightmares of anyone who heard it. "The loop!" James shouted over the chaos. "It's breaking down. All the souls they trapped, they're being released." He was right. Throughout the city, I could see light pouring from every window, every doorway. But it wasn't the sickly illumination of the Parliament's gas lamps. This was pure daylight, the real light of the true Victorian era breaking through. And with it came the people they had imprisoned. Countless souls finally freed from their temporal cages. The great mechanism made one final attempt to maintain control. Its gears began to spin in impossible directions, trying to rewrite the very fabric of reality. The ground beneath our feet buckled and transformed, cycling through centuries in seconds. The sky above became a kaleidoscope of different eras, each fighting for dominance. But the chronograph's power had grown too strong to stop. I turned its final dial, and the device released a pulse of pure, uncorrupted time that tore through everything the Parliament had built. Their carefully constructed prison of moments began to dissolve, revealing the truth they had tried so hard to hide. The real Victorian London emerged from beneath the corruption like a flower blooming in fast motion. The twisted architecture of the Parliament's version crumbled away, revealing the actual buildings, streets, and people they had imprisoned. The fog lifted, replaced by genuine London air, still thick with coal smoke, but natural, real. The Parliament members made one last, desperate attempt to maintain their form, but they were fighting against the very nature of time itself. Their bodies began to unravel, releasing all the moments they had stolen over the centuries. The sound of their dissolution was like the ticking of a million watches, suddenly stopping at once. The great mechanism, no longer supported by their power, collapsed in on itself. Its massive form imploded with a sound that existed outside of normal reality, taking with it the last remnants of their corrupted version of history. In its place stood the real Buckingham Palace, solid and true in the morning light. As the dust settled, I looked at the chronograph in my hands. The device had transformed one final time, It was now a simple pocket watch, keeping perfect time with the natural flow of moments. The corrupted version of London was gone, and with it the Parliament's power to twist time to their will. Isabella and James stood beside me, their forms now solid and real. Around us, the freed souls of the Parliament's victims were returning to their proper places in history. The city was healing itself, finding its way back to the path it should have taken. "It's over," Isabella said softly. "The real Victorian era. It's finally free." But as I watched the city restore itself, I noticed something strange. My own form was beginning to fade, becoming transparent like a photograph left too long in the sun. Of course, I didn't belong here. This was the true Victorian London, and I was from a different time entirely. "The temporal barriers are realigning," James explained, noticing my condition. "Everyone is returning to their proper time, including you." I looked at Isabella, who smiled sadly. "We always knew this would happen, but we'll be all right. We're finally where we belong, in the real history, not their twisted version of it." The chronograph in my hands grew warm one last time. As my vision began to blur, I saw London as it truly was in that era. Beautiful, dirty, complex, and above all, real. No longer a prison of the Parliament's design, but a living city, moving forward through time as it was meant to. The last thing I heard before everything faded was the sound of genuine Victorian London, waking up to a new day. Carriages on cobblestones, street vendors calling their wares, the distant whistle of steam engines. Real sounds from a real time, finally freed from the shadows that had imprisoned them. Then there was a sensation of falling through time, of moments rushing past like pages in a book. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my flat in modern London. The chronograph was gone, but on my desk lay a collection of perfectly preserved Victorian documents, proof that the true history had finally been restored. Outside my window, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware that anything had changed. But I knew the truth. Somewhere in the restored flow of time, the real Victorian era was proceeding as it always should have, free from the Parliament's corruption. And in that true version of history, Isabella and James and all the others were finally living the lives they were meant to have. I still catch myself looking for signs of temporal distortion in the shadows sometimes, or listening for the sound of time being twisted out of shape. But the only ticking I hear now is from ordinary clocks, marking the natural passage of moments. The Parliament of Shadows is gone, their false London destroyed, and time flows as it should. But sometimes, on very quiet nights, I swear I can still hear the echo of that other London, not the corrupted version, but the real one we freed. And in those moments, I know that somewhere, in the vast flow of history, the true Victorian era lives on, its story finally being told the way it was meant to be.